He thought he was done with life, until a one-eyed horse walked out of a blizzard, carrying a dying foal on its back. They said no man could survive a Wyoming winter alone. But one frozen dawn, Ethan Cole stepped outside his cabin and saw the impossible. A giant, one-eyed stallion staggering through the storm with a limp foal tied to its back. From that moment, the silence he'd chosen to live in would never be silent again. The wind had a way of finding every crack in Ethan Cole's cabin. It slid through the warped planks like a whisper that wouldn't die, brushing against the old coffee tins and empty whiskey bottles lined on the windowsill. Outside, the plains of Sage Creek stretched white and endless beneath the Wyoming sky. Winter had come early that year. Early and without mercy. Ethan sat by the stove, hands cupped around a chipped mug, watching the fire crawl across the logs. The smell of pine smoke filled the room, heavy but somehow comforting. His dog, Dusty, slept near the hearth, tail twitching in some dream of better days. Ethan hadn't dreamed in months. Dreams required rest, and rest was a thing he'd forgotten how to do. He'd come here after the fire, the one that took his wife and little girl. A lightning strike, they'd said, a freak storm that turned the ridge above town into a furnace. By the time Ethan got there, the barn had already fallen in on itself, and the world had turned the color of ash. Every time he closed his eyes, he still heard Lily's laughter mixing with the crack of burning wood. He'd sold the last of his horses, gave away the ranch, and disappeared north. The locals said he was running from God. Maybe they were right. He'd built this shack near the edge of the creek because the silence here was too deep to argue with. Every morning was the same. Boil water, patch the fence, mend the saddle straps, check the traps by the stream. Routine was all that kept the ghosts quiet. At night, he'd sit outside with the lantern and watch the mountains turn blue under the moon. Sometimes the wind carried the faint cry of coyotes. Sometimes, if he listened long enough, it almost sounded like a child calling his name. He'd tell himself it was just the wind. It always was. That afternoon, the snow started again, thick, wet flakes drifting sideways in the wind. By sundown, Sage Creek had disappeared under a white shroud. Ethan tossed another log into the fire and leaned back in his chair. The heat made the room glow with an amber hue, catching on the old photograph pinned above the mantel. His wife, Anna, their daughter, Lily, and him, squinting in the sun, all of them unaware how brief that moment would be. He poured a finger of bourbon into his mug and muttered, "Here's to you, sweetheart," before drinking. The burn in his throat was the only thing that still felt real. When the wood popped, he looked up sharply. For a second, he thought he'd heard something else, something faint and rhythmic beneath the wind. He tilted his head, listening. Nothing. Just the storm pressing against the walls like a heavy hand. He rubbed his temples, sighed, and whispered to the dog, "We're getting jumpy, boy." Dusty lifted his head, ears twitching, then settled again. The cabin creaked and moaned. Ethan stared into the fire, letting his eyes blur until the flames became shapes. Horse legs, a child's hair, smoke rising from the wreckage. He closed his eyes. He wasn't looking for peace anymore. He'd learned to live inside the ache. Out here, there was no one to remind him what he'd lost, no one to tell him to move on. Outside, the night fell silent, so silent it hummed. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless. The creek behind the cabin froze in mid-flow, its surface shimmering faintly under the half-moon. Ethan stood, poured out the dregs of his drink, and walked to the door. When he opened it, the wind hit him full in the chest. Cold, alive, filled with 1,000 small voices. He looked out across the frozen valley, his breath turning to mist. Nothing moved. No light, no sound, only the long stretch of white beneath a black sky. He stepped outside anyway, boots crunching on the crusted snow. The horizon glowed faintly, the kind of glow that came from the moon trying to fight its way through clouds. His breath came slow, steady. Somewhere deep down, a part of him was waiting. For what, he didn't know. He listened. And then, for the briefest heartbeat, he thought he heard it again. A dull, heavy rhythm. Distant, but deliberate. Thud. Pause. Thud. The sound carried through the storm, too slow for a deer, too uneven for the wind. Dusty barked once inside, sharp and unsure. Ethan froze, eyes scanning the white void. There it was again. Thud. Pause. Thud. Something was moving out there. He took a step forward, squinting into the blur of snow, his breath catching in his throat. A shape flickered in the distance, massive, swaying, half swallowed by fog. For a moment he thought it was a trick of light, the way moonshine plays games with the snow. But the sound didn't lie. The earth itself seemed to shudder beneath each step. The wind shifted, carrying a strange scent, metal, smoke, and blood. Ethan's pulse quickened. He whispered to no one. "What in God's name?" The shape came closer, emerging through the haze. A horse, enormous, dark, its mane stiff with ice. And across its back, lashed down by leather straps, lay something small. A foal, limp and lifeless. The sight rooted him where he stood. Snowflakes clung to his eyelashes. He didn't blink. The animal's single good eye caught the light of his lantern. A burning gold, half mad, half pleading. For a long moment, man and beast stared at each other through the storm. Then the horse staggered, legs buckling beneath its own weight. Ethan's hand went to his chest, as if to steady the heart that suddenly hurt to carry. Dusty barked again from the doorway, sharp and frightened. The wind roared louder, the world turned white. And then, through the chaos, the sound came one last time. Thud. Pause. Thud. Ethan dropped the lantern into the snow and ran forward. The storm swallowed his breath as Ethan ran forward, boots breaking through the crusted snow. The lantern lay behind him, a dim blur of orange swallowed by the wind. Ahead, the shape of the giant horse swayed, legs trembling, steam rising off its body like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan could hear the ragged rasp of its lungs, each breath thick with pain. When he reached it, he stopped short. The animal was enormous, taller than any draft horse he'd ever seen. Its hide was torn in long, dark streaks, as though it had run through barbed wire for miles. One eye was clouded and useless. The other burned a dull gold through the snow. Across its back lay a foal bound by leather straps, its small body slick with blood and frost. "Easy now," Ethan whispered, voice nearly lost in the wind. He moved slowly, palms open, the way he would when calming a frightened mare. But this horse didn't rear. It didn't shy away. It simply stood, breathing hard, the muscles in its shoulders shaking with the effort to stay upright. Ethan reached for the straps. The leather was frozen stiff, edges crusted with ice. He pulled at one, but it held fast. The horse gave a low, guttural sound, half warning, half plea. Its legs buckled again. Ethan's instinct took over. He drew the hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the first strap. The sound was sharp, final. The second snapped with a jerk. The foal slid from the mare's back into his arms, light but limp. Its head lolled against his shoulder, nostrils flaring faintly. Still alive, barely. "You hold on, little one," Ethan said, the words automatic, the same tone he once used for his daughter when she fell from the corral fence. The horse swayed, lowering its head until its muzzle brushed his arm. For an instant, their eyes met, man and beast, both half broken by loss, both carrying something that should have died long ago. Then the horse exhaled once, a long, heavy sound that steamed into the night air. It sank to its knees, the ground trembling under its weight. Ethan stepped back, clutching the foal tight. The great body folded, the head dropping slowly to the snow. There was no struggle, no panic, just release. Silence fell over Sage Creek. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan knelt beside it, one gloved hand resting on the cold flank. "You did good," he murmured again. His breath fogged and vanished. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked. Not a sob, not yet, but the quiet breaking of stone. The foal twitched weakly. Ethan looked down and saw its tiny chest rise and fall, faint but steady. He stood, hoisting it against his chest, and turned toward the cabin. Dusty barked once from the porch, tail low, uncertain. "Inside, boy," Ethan called, pushing through the drifts. The snow was knee-deep, the cold biting through his jeans. By the time he reached the door, his arms burned from the weight. Inside, he laid the foal near the stove, wrapping it in the old wool blanket he'd used to cover firewood. The heat licked at his hands as he rubbed its sides, trying to coax warmth back into the trembling body. Its breath came in small, uneven bursts. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup, then dipped his fingers and touched the foal's lips. Nothing. He tried again. This time, the tiny mouth moved, swallowing a drop. "That's it," he said softly. "Easy now." The smell of smoke filled the room again, but this time it didn't carry pain. It carried life. Dusty lay nearby, ears pricked, watching the strange visitor with wary curiosity. When the foal finally went still, Ethan thought he'd lost it. He leaned close, listening for breath. Then he heard it, a faint, irregular rhythm, like a distant drum. He sat back slowly, exhaling. Through the window, the storm howled across the plain. Snow hit the glass in sheets, rattling the pane like bones. Ethan glanced toward the door, where his coat still hung heavy with frost. Out there, the dead horse lay half buried already, the storm erasing its tracks. He should go back in the morning, he thought. Give it a grave, something decent. The foal stirred, drawing his attention. He reached out, brushing snowmelt from its forehead. Its skin was slick, the hair thin and soft beneath his palm. He could feel the faint beat of a heart. Unsteady, stubborn, unwilling to quit. "You and me both," he said quietly. He sat there for a long time, feeding the fire, listening to the wood crackle. Every now and then, the foal made a small sound, a low sigh, almost human. Each one pulled him further from the dark places in his mind. He realized he was whispering without meaning to. Fragments of lullabies, old rodeo songs, anything that might keep the silence from swallowing the room. Hours passed. The storm raged, then eased. When it finally went quiet, he opened the door a crack. The world outside glowed faintly under the moon, every surface coated in new snow. The body of the mare was gone beneath it, only a single rise in the white field showing where she'd fallen. Ethan stood there, bareheaded in the cold, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was speaking to, the horse, the wind, or something older. When he turned back inside, the foal's eyes were half open, dark as midnight. They met his for the first time. "There you are," he said, kneeling. "We're both still here." He fed the stove another log, then sat down beside the small body, the heat wrapped around them, flickering against the walls. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and relentless. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't dread the dawn. He looked at the foal, at its fragile chest rising and falling in rhythm with the firelight, and realized the truth that would keep him awake till morning. This little creature hadn't just stumbled into his world. It had come to drag him back into it. By the time dawn broke over Sage Creek, the world had turned to glass. Every branch, every fence post glittered under a thin crust of ice. The sky carried that strange stillness that comes after a night-long storm, when the wind has finally exhausted itself, leaving only the hush of survival. Ethan pushed open the cabin door, the hinges groaning. Cold air poured in, biting at his face. He stepped out onto the porch, snow squeaking beneath his boots. In the distance, the mound of white where the mare had fallen was almost gone. Only a faint rise in the snow betrayed her grave. He stood there for a while, breath clouding the air, hat pulled low against the pale sun. The silence was so complete, he could hear the faint crackle of frost forming on his sleeves. Something about it felt sacred, like the land itself was keeping a vigil. When he turned back inside, the foal stirred. Ethan knelt beside it, touching its neck. The skin was warm now. It opened its eyes, dark pools that reflected the flicker of firelight. For the first time, the animal seemed aware of him. "Morning, little one," he said quietly. It blinked, weak but alive. Ethan smiled without meaning to. The feeling was awkward, foreign. He took one of Anna's old bowls from the shelf and filled it with warm water from the kettle. Then, with the patience of someone who had once trained horses for frightened children, he coaxed the foal to drink. It took a few tries, a few soft words, but finally the animal swallowed. "There you go," he murmured. "That's the way." Dusty sat a few feet away, head cocked, tail sweeping slowly across the floor. He had the look of someone deciding whether this new thing was friend or trouble. Ethan reached out and scratched behind the dog's ear. "She's a guest," he said. "Don't start something you can't finish." When he looked down again, he realized he'd called the foal she without thinking. It felt right. She was smaller than he'd thought, all legs and ribs, her coat mottled gray beneath the grime. He found an old brush, and as he worked through the knots of frozen hair, the cabin filled with the sound of steady breathing. Two survivors rediscovering rhythm. Hours passed that way. The storm outside softened into a flurry, then stopped. The fire sank low, the light turning amber. Ethan warmed some oatmeal on the stove, ate a few bites, then left the rest to cool. He wasn't hungry. His hands shook from exhaustion, not hunger. When night came again, he sat by the window, staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the mare lay beneath the snow. He thought about digging a proper grave come morning, maybe marking it with a post. Something simple, honest. He'd buried plenty in his life. Friends lost to rodeo accidents, a father who drank himself quiet, a wife and child taken by fire. But this felt different. The mare had carried something that wasn't hers to carry, all the way through hell. He whispered, "You did good." Again, this time to the night. Behind him, the foal gave a small noise, a half whinny, weak but defiant. Ethan turned. She was trying to stand, legs splaying awkwardly. "Easy," he said, rising. He steadied her by the shoulders, his palms flat against trembling muscle. Slowly, she found her balance. For a moment, she stood. Then her knees buckled, and she slumped into the straw. Ethan laughed softly, the sound low and worn. "You've got more fight than sense," he said. But he understood. You stand, you fall, you try again. It was the only rule worth keeping. He went to the shelf and pulled down an old notebook, the kind used to track breeding lines back when he ran the ranch. He flipped it open to a blank page and wrote, "Day 1. Found her in the storm. Mare gone. Foal alive." The words looked strange in his handwriting, like they belonged to someone else. Outside, the wind rose briefly, stirring the eaves, then fell silent. That night, Ethan dreamed for the first time in years. He was back in the old rodeo ring, sunlight blazing off the rails, Lily laughing in the stands. She held a toy horse in her hands, its single painted eye gleaming. He waved to her, but the crowd noise swallowed the sound. Then fire poured over the ring, the world turning gold and red. When he woke, his hands were clenched tight around the blanket. The foal slept beside the stove, chest rising slow and even. Ethan sat up, rubbed his eyes, and whispered, "It's just a dream, that's all." But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a warning. He stood and threw on his coat. The door opened to a dawn washed pale and endless. The cold bit through the wool, sharp enough to make his lungs ache. He trudged to the rise where the mare had fallen. The snow was waist-deep now, glittering under the sun. He dug with a shovel until he hit something hard. Frozen earth, not flesh. She was too far gone to reach. He took off his hat, stood there a while, then drove the shovel into the ground like a marker. "Rest easy," he said. The wind caught the brim of his hat, rattling it against his thigh. When he turned to go, he noticed tracks leading down toward the creek. Not animal, not human. Half melted, circular, almost like something dragged. The snow blurred their edges. He frowned. Maybe from the night before. Maybe something else. Back inside, the foal was awake again, watching him with that steady gaze. He knelt beside her and said, "We're not done yet." He reached into the feed sack for oats, crushed them fine, mixed them with warm water. As he worked, he found himself talking. About the barn that used to stand here, about Anna's biscuits, about how the mountains looked in spring. He hadn't said that much in months, maybe years. By evening, the foal was standing on her own. Wobbly, yes, but upright. Ethan felt something stir inside. Him. A pulse he hadn't trusted in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or just the stubborn will to keep breathing. He leaned back against the wall, watching her nose around the straw. "You're tougher than you look," he said. "Guess that makes two of us." The sky outside turned violet, shadows stretching long across the valley. Smoke rose from the stovepipe, drifting into the dusk. Ethan thought of how strange it was. A man and a horse, both lost, both saved by the same storm. He didn't know yet that this small heartbeat beside him would be the one to change everything. He only knew the silence had started to sound different now, less like loneliness, more like the space where something new could begin. Night fell softly over Sage Creek, the kind of still night when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan sat near the stove, the flames painting his face in amber and shadow. The foal, his small guest from the storm, slept on a nest of straw by the wall. Her breathing was deeper now, steadier. Outside, snow pressed against the cabin like a hand, sealing them away from the world. The cabin smelled of smoke and wet wool. Every time Ethan added a log, sparks leapt up the stovepipe and disappeared into the dark. It had been 3 nights since he'd found her. He still hadn't named her. Somehow a name felt too permanent, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He sat with his hands open toward the fire, listening to the soft pops and sighs of burning wood. It reminded him of the nights before everything burned. The family ranch alive with light, Anna humming while she mended shirts, Lily drawing horses on scraps of paper by the window. He could almost hear them. A sharp hiss from the stove brought him back. The foal stirred, letting out a faint whimper, not quite a whinny. Ethan moved closer, crouching beside her. Her skin was still hot from the fever. He dipped a rag into the pot of warm water and wiped gently along her neck. When he reached the side of her jaw, he froze. Beneath the fur ran a raw, straight line, a rope burn. He leaned closer. The wound was too clean to be from the wild. Someone had tied her, maybe to a post, maybe to a tree. The thought made his stomach tighten. "What kind of fool does that to a creature this small?" he muttered. The foal flinched slightly, as if the memory still lived in her skin. Ethan set the rag aside and took a deep breath. He'd seen cruelty before. Men who beat their animals because they couldn't stand their own weakness. It was the same kind of sickness that had made him hide out here, only turned outward instead of inward. He stroked the foal's forehead. "You're safe now, girl. I got you." The words surprised him. They sounded like something Anna would have said. Steady, gentle, certain. He swallowed hard, then stood and crossed the room. He poured a splash of whiskey into his cup, not for warmth this time, but to steady the tremor in his chest. When he turned, back, the firelight caught on the foal's eye. Dark, glistening, alive. There was no fear there, only exhaustion and a strange kind of faith. It unnerved him. He'd forgotten what faith looked like. Later, he tried to sleep in the chair by the stove, but the dreams came fast. He saw fire again. Red walls collapsing, the sound of wood splitting, Lily's small voice calling from somewhere he couldn't reach. He woke with a start, sweat cold on his neck. The room was still. The foal had lifted her head, watching him with quiet eyes. He laughed softly. Guess neither of us sleeps easy. He reached down, touching her muzzle. The warmth of her breath met his palm. For a moment, something loosened inside him, something that had been locked tight for too long. Morning came gray and heavy. The storm had moved east, leaving the air raw and silent. Ethan opened the door to a valley scrubbed clean. White ridges, blue shadows, and the faint steam of the creek beginning to thaw. The world looked new, but he didn't trust it yet. He returned to find the foal struggling to her feet again. She managed 3 shaky steps before her knees gave out. Ethan caught her, laughing under his breath. Slow down, kid. The world's not going anywhere. He helped her settle, then noticed her sniffing toward the stove. Her nose twitched, ears flicking. She was searching for heat, for life. He built the fire higher. The orange light filled the small cabin, bouncing off the walls, touching the old photographs with color for the first time in years. It made the air smell like pine resin and smoke, like home. Ethan knelt again and spoke without thinking. You're tougher than you look, you know that. The foal answered with a sound that was half breath, half sigh. Something about that noise reached him deeper than words. It wasn't gratitude. It was understanding. As the day passed, he worked quietly. He mended a torn saddle strap, sharpened the axe, cleared the porch of snow. Each time he glanced inside, the foal was watching him, as if measuring the distance between them. It reminded him of Lily again, how she'd watch him fix fences, waiting for the right moment to hand him the next nail. He'd thought that part of his life was gone. But now, standing in the snow with his hands raw from the cold, he felt something small and fierce stirring in his chest. A spark that refused to die. That night, he fed the fire until the cabin glowed gold. He dragged a chair close to the stove, laid another blanket over the foal, and finally spoke aloud to the empty room. You deserve a name, don't you? He looked into her dark eyes. Something that lasts. He thought of the valley outside, where sagebrush grew even after fire. The scent of it filled the air each summer, sharp and sweet. It was the first plant to come back after the blaze, stubborn and alive. He nodded slowly. Sage, he said. That's you. The foal blinked once, as if accepting the word. All right, Sage, Ethan whispered. We'll get through the winter. Both of us. He leaned back in the chair, staring into the flames. The light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, turning the cabin into something that almost felt like home again. The fire crackled softly. Sage shifted in her sleep, letting out a tiny breath. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Thin flakes this time, drifting more like ash than ice. They tapped against the window pane, soft and steady. Ethan watched them for a long while, then closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the fire that had taken everything. He was thinking about the fire that was still burning, the one flickering quietly beside him, alive in the heartbeat of a creature too small to carry so much hope. When he finally slept, he dreamed not of loss, but of motion. A horse running through smoke toward a sky streaked with dawn, carrying something fragile but unbroken. Morning came to Sage Creek with a faint streak of rose along the horizon. The wind had calmed, leaving a silence so clean it almost rang. Ethan woke before the fire died, the cabin still dim but warm from the embers. For a long moment he simply sat there, listening to the soft sound of breathing, his and the foal's, mingling in rhythm. Sage was already awake, her head lifted, ears flicking toward every creak of the wood. The fever had broken overnight. Her coat shimmered faintly under the weak light, revealing its true color, silver gray, the shade of ash left behind after rain. Ethan crouched beside her, rubbing her shoulder. "You made it, girl," he said softly. "Didn't think either of us would." Outside, the world was dazzling. The storm had scoured everything clean, laying a sheen of white across the valley. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, sharp enough to sting. Ethan filled a bucket at the creek, the water biting at his hands, then carried it inside. Sage drank in short gulps, and when she finished, she nudged his arm with her nose. That small gesture, the warmth of it, made him smile in spite of himself. He hadn't smiled like that in years. For the next few days, Ethan found himself falling into a rhythm he hadn't expected. He woke early, stoked the fire, checked Sage's wounds, and walked the perimeter of the cabin. When the light stretched long and golden, he'd let her stand by the open door, her nose twitching at the scent of freedom just beyond the steps. Each evening, as the sun went down behind the ridge, they would sit in that same quiet, the man and the foal, breathing in time with the land. He was fixing the fence one afternoon when he heard it, the soft clatter of hooves behind him. He turned, startled. Sage had followed him outside, the rope he'd tied slipping loose from the post. Her legs trembled, but she stood tall, sniffing at the world she'd nearly left behind. "Well, I'll be damned," Ethan murmured, walking over. "You don't listen worth a lick." He didn't scold her. He couldn't. She looked too proud, too alive. For the first time, the space around him didn't feel like a graveyard. The snow began to melt by noon, thin rivulets cutting through the drifts and exposing patches of brown grass. A hawk circled above, its shadow sliding across the white. Sage lifted her head, eyes following the movement. Ethan watched her watching it, and he realized she wasn't afraid anymore. That evening, he brushed her coat by firelight. The brush moved through the hair in soft, rhythmic strokes, each one loosening another knot of fear in both of them. He caught himself humming an old tune, something Lily used to hum while braiding her doll's hair. The memory came gently this time, like a feather landing instead of a blade cutting. He spoke quietly, not to the horse, not to anyone really. "She'd have loved you, Sage. She had that same wild streak, pretended she wasn't scared of anything." His voice faltered, but he kept brushing. "Guess you'd have run circles around her, though." The foal leaned her head into his shoulder, a weight so small, yet grounding him more than words ever could. The next morning, he decided to try something bold. He opened the cabin door wide, stepped aside, and said, "Go on, then. Let's see what you've got." Sage hesitated at the threshold, one hoof testing the step, then another. The world beyond was bright and huge, sky stretching forever, the creek glinting like glass, the line of pines rising dark and tall in the distance. Ethan waited, patient. When she finally stepped out, it was slow and deliberate, every muscle taut with wonder. She walked a few feet into the snow, then stopped to breathe. Her nostrils flared, drawing in the scent of sagebrush carried on the wind. The smell made Ethan's throat tighten. It was the scent of summers past, the hills before the fire, the air thick with life. Sage turned her head toward him, eyes reflecting the same silver light that rolled over the snow. In that look, Ethan saw the thing he hadn't dared believe in for years: forgiveness. Not from God, not from anyone else, but from life itself. The simple mercy of another chance. He took a step closer, hand resting on her neck. "You're gonna make it," he whispered. "You and me both." That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind had changed again, no longer biting but soft, brushing through the cracks in the cabin like a voice trying to speak. Ethan sat at the table, the old ledger open before him. He picked up the pencil and wrote carefully on a blank page. Day 7. Sage, standing, eating, curious about the world. First sign of spring in the air. He paused, tapping the pencil against the page. For years, his journals had been filled with records of loss. Numbers, debts, names of horses he'd buried. This page felt different. It wasn't a record of survival. It was a record of return. He set the pencil down and stared into the fire. The glow of it reminded him of another kind of light. The kind that had once filled the windows of his ranch house before the fire took it. But this light was gentler. It didn't demand anything. It just existed. Sage lay nearby, her head tucked against her legs, her body reflecting the orange shimmer. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes heavy. "You're the light, aren't you?" he murmured. "The one I forgot I had." Outside, the moon rose high, spilling pale light across the valley. The ice on the creek cracked with the slow sound of thawing. Ethan dozed in the chair, the warmth of the stove washing over him. He dreamed again. Only this time, there was no fire, no screaming wind. There was Lily, standing in a field of sage, her hand resting on the neck of a small gray foal. She turned to him and smiled. When he woke, the fire had burned low, but the warmth lingered. Sage lifted her head, blinking at him. The look in her eyes was calm, almost knowing. Ethan reached for the poker, stirred the coals, and watched the flames rise again. It struck him then that fires didn't always destroy. Sometimes they made room for new things to grow. He whispered to the horse, "Morning, Sage. Let's see what today's got for us." The words hung in the air like a quiet promise as the first thin light of dawn slid across the floorboards and turned the gray world gold. The thaw came slow to Sage Creek, as if the land itself was uncertain it could trust warmth again. By early March, the snow had thinned into long silver veins running through the grass. The creek began to whisper beneath its skin of ice, testing its voice after months of silence. Ethan spent his mornings outside now, mending fences, splitting wood, and clearing the path to the barn that hadn't seen use in years. Sage followed him, no longer the fragile shadow he had carried through the storm, but a curious, steady presence. She would nose at his pockets, steal the cuff of his glove, or nip at the shovel handle when he paused too long. Her energy was uneven, wild, like the wind changing direction without warning. Ethan had grown used to the sound of her hooves behind him, the soft, rhythmic reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes, when she trotted close enough that her breath brushed his shoulder, he caught himself murmuring to her without thinking, the same way he used to talk to his daughter on long rides. One morning, as he was repairing the east fence, the crunch of tires startled him. A county truck rolled up the hill, sunlight glinting off the chrome. A man stepped out, dusting snow from his boots. His badge caught the light. Sheriff Morgan. Ethan hadn't seen him in years, not since the fire. The lawman looked older now, lines carved deeper around his eyes, the kind carved by long winters and longer regrets. "Didn't expect to find anyone still living up this way," Morgan said, voice even. His gaze slid past Ethan to Tut, the foal grazing near the fence line. "That yours?" Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Found her after the last storm. Mare didn't make it." Morgan studied the horse, frowning. "Funny thing. A ranch down south reported missing stock about 2 weeks back. Young foal, gray coat, rope burns around the neck. Sound familiar?" Ethan felt the words like cold water. "I don't take what isn't mine." "Didn't say you did." Morgan kicked at the snow, his boots leaving dark impressions. "But folks talk. You've been up here alone a long time. Strange things happen in isolation." He paused. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Before Ethan could answer, Sage stepped forward, head high, nostrils flaring, her ears pinned back, and for the first time Ethan heard her make a low, warning sound. It wasn't fear, it was protection. "She doesn't like strangers," Ethan said quietly. Morgan froze. Seems she knows her mind. He took a step closer anyway. Sage's muscles tightened, hooves shifting in the snow. "That's close enough," Ethan said, moving between them. His voice was calm, but the edge in it was clear. "You scare her, she'll bolt. And if she runs, she won't survive another winter." For a moment, the two men faced each other, the only sound the wind scraping over the ridge. Then Morgan sighed and took a slow step back. "You always did have a way with wild things." "Not wild," Ethan said. "Just trying to live." Morgan looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "You still drink?" "Sometimes," Ethan admitted. "Still pray?" "Never stopped." Morgan nodded once. "Then I'll trust your word. But if the ranchers come asking, you send word to me first. You don't want them coming here angry." He turned toward the truck, his boots crunching on the ice. Over his shoulder he added, "You were a good man once, Cole. Don't let the mountain convince you you're anything else." The sound of the truck faded down the hill until only the wind remained. Sage stepped forward, pressing her nose against Ethan's back. He turned, hand resting on her neck. "You handled that better than I did," he whispered. That night, the sky bled into shades of blue and violet. The fire in the stove glowed steady, the air thick with the smell of pine resin. Ethan sat at the table, turning Morgan's words over in his mind. He hadn't thought of himself as a good man in a long time. The phrase felt foreign, like a borrowed coat that didn't fit anymore. Sage dozed near the door, her flank rising and falling in the firelight. He studied her silhouette, the curve of her ribs, the faint shimmer of her silver coat. He couldn't deny she'd changed the rhythm of his life. He spoke more now, worked longer, dreamed lighter. But along with the change came something sharper. Fear. Fear of losing her. Fear of what she'd stir up inside him. He poured a splash of coffee into his tin, cup, and stared out the window. The moon had risen low, reflecting off the creek like a blade. Beyond the fence, something moved, a flicker of shadow against the snow. His hand went instinctively to the rifle by the door, but when he looked again, the shape was gone. Just wind, or maybe memory. In the stillness, he thought he heard a sound, a single, heavy hoofbeat echoing from somewhere deep in the valley. He held his breath. Nothing followed. He told himself it was just the ice shifting. But the hair on his neck stayed raised long after the silence returned. The next day, he found Sage restless. She pawed at the ground, ears flicking toward the wood. Her muscles quivered as though she could sense something he couldn't. Ethan tried to distract her with hay, soft words, anything to ease the tension, but she kept glancing toward the ridge. "What is it, girl?" he asked. "Coyotes? Elk?" She didn't answer, of course, but her unease settled into him like cold through the seams of a coat. He spent the afternoon repairing the barn door, forcing himself to focus on the rhythm of hammer and nail. Still, every so often he caught her staring into the distance, body taut, breath fogging in quick bursts. By nightfall, she'd calmed again. Maybe it had been nothing, just nerves, the leftover instinct of an animal that had survived too much. But as Ethan closed the shutters and checked the locks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the valley, like the world holding its breath for the next change. Before turning in, he walked to where Sage lay curled in the straw. He knelt, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said softly. "No one's taking you away. Not this time." She blinked slowly, as if she understood. Outside, the creek murmured in its thaw, and the mountains answered with a low sigh. Ethan sat by the fire until the last ember dulled to red. He thought about Morgan's face, the suspicion behind his polite tone, and the way the foal had stood her ground. There were stories the land carried, he realized. Stories written in hoofprints and scars and silence. Sage had her story. So did he. He wasn't sure whose was heavier. When he finally blew out the lamp, he whispered to the dark, "Whatever comes next, we face it together." The wind picked up then, brushing against the cabin walls like fingertips. Somewhere far off, a single echo rose, a low, distant whinny rolling through the valley, fading into the cold. Ethan froze. It wasn't Sage. She was right beside him. He stood in the half-light, heart pounding, listening. But when the sound didn't come again, he sat back down, staring into the ashes until they cooled to gray. He didn't see it, but through the frost on the window pane, a set of hoofprints marked the snow outside, large, deep, half-filled with moonlight. The weather turned without warning, the way it always did in the high country. One moment the valley was clear, the air soft as breath, and the next the clouds were piling over the ridge like gray soldiers, swallowing the horizon. Ethan stood by the barn, an axe in his hand, the scent of rain sharp and electric. Sage paced near the fence, head tossing, ears twitching toward the rising wind. He could sense it too, the shift in the air, the kind that carried more than weather. It carried memory. He'd learned to read the sky like a man reads a letter from an old enemy. It said something's coming. By dusk, the light had drained from the world. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, melting on his jacket before freezing again. He hurried to haul the last of the wood inside, latching the barn doors against the gusts. Sage stamped and whickered, nervous. He threw a blanket across her back and spoke low and even. "We'll sit it out, girl. Just another long night." The storm hit just as he reached the cabin. The first blast of wind slammed the door against his back, the sound like a gunshot. Inside, the shutters rattled. The roof groaned. Dusty barked once, then curled under the table, nose pressed to his paws. Ethan stoked the fire until the stove roared, filling the room with orange light. Outside, the world vanished into white noise. He sat by the window, the coffee cooling in his hands, eyes following the flicker of the flames. The storm sounded different this time, not just wild, but heavy, almost deliberate. Every gust felt like it had weight, intent. He thought of the night he'd found Sage and the giant horse that had carried her through the snow. He shook his head. Ghost stories. That's all they were. The mind plays tricks when you're alone too long. Still, he couldn't ignore the way the wind seemed to move in rhythm. Thud. Pause. Thud. He frowned. That sound. He'd heard it once before. Setting the cup aside, he crossed the room, listening. The storm howled, rattling the eaves, but beneath it, faint, deliberate, came the same 3-beat rhythm. Hooves. Heavy ones. Not possible, he whispered. He pulled on his coat and grabbed the oil lamp. The flame quivered as he lifted it, casting his shadow long across the wall. The wind fought him every inch as he opened the door. Snow swept in, blinding and cold, slicing across his face. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing but chaos. Then, through the blur, a shape formed. Tall, black, unmoving. A horse. Ethan's breath caught. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, half buried in snow, steam pouring from its nostrils. Its mane whipped like smoke, its body streaked with frost. One eye was nothing but darkness, the other burned gold against the storm. The same horse, the same impossible giant. He took a step forward, then stopped. His instincts screamed to run back inside, to shut the door and pray. But something deeper, a quieter, older part of him, kept him rooted. You came back, he said, voice nearly lost to the wind. The horse didn't move. It simply turned its head toward the barn. Ethan followed its gaze. Through the white blur, he could see Sage's outline behind the slats. Restless, pacing. The wind shifted, carrying a sound low and mournful, almost like a sigh. Ethan swallowed hard. She's safe, he said aloud, though he wasn't sure why. You did your part. The horse lowered its head slightly, the golden eye never leaving him. For a moment, he thought he saw something like understanding flicker there. Then the storm surged, swallowing the space between them. Snow spiraled upward, wrapping around the figure until it shimmered, half there, half gone. Wait, Ethan shouted. Don't! But the words dissolved in the wind. The horse stamped once, a deep, resonant sound that rolled across the ground like thunder. Then it turned away, walking into the white, until it disappeared completely. Ethan stood there long after the shape was gone, the lamp's flame guttering against the wind. Snow gathered in his hair, on his shoulders, his breath turning to ice. He didn't move until the cold finally forced him back inside. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing the world out. He leaned against it, heart hammering, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Sage was still restless in the barn. He could hear her hooves through the storm wall. He moved to the stove, threw in another log, and crouched beside Dusty, whose eyes were wide and alert. You saw it too, didn't you, boy? He whispered. The dog gave a low whine. He stayed there until the fire's warmth began to thaw the numbness in his hands. Every few minutes, another gust shook the cabin, making the roof creak. He couldn't shake the image of that golden eye staring through the storm. Hours passed. The wind howled and then began to tire, settling into a low moan. When it finally eased, the silence that followed felt alive, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ethan opened the door again, half afraid of what he'd find. The storm had left everything buried and new. The drifts were high, the fences nearly gone beneath the white. And yet, just a few feet from the porch, there were prints, massive, clean, leading away toward the ridge. Each one perfect, unblurred by the wind. He knelt, touching the edge of one. The snow burned his skin. "You were real," he said softly. "You were real." Behind him, Sage called, a short, sharp whinny, urgent. Ethan turned. She was at the barn door, pawing the wood, her eyes wide and bright in the dim light. He hurried to her, opening the latch. She pressed her head against his chest, breathing fast, the heat of her body radiating through his coat. He held her until she calmed. When she finally pulled away, she turned her head toward the same direction the prints led, ears forward, tail flicking. Ethan followed her gaze. The ridge glimmered under the moonlight, silver against the blue-black sky. Somewhere out there, the ghost of that great horse was moving still, keeping its silent watch. He laid a hand on Sage's neck. "We'll see him again," he said quietly. "When it's time." Back inside, the fire had burned low. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, the first in weeks. He didn't drink it right away. He just held it, letting the warmth of it sit in his palm. For the first time, the drink didn't feel like escape. It felt like memory. A way to honor something larger than understanding. When he finally took a sip, he raised it toward the window, where the stormlight flickered faintly along the snow. "Rest easy, old boy," he said. "You earned it." The wind shifted once more, brushing softly against the cabin walls. It almost sounded like breathing. Ethan sat there until dawn, watching the horizon blush with the first hint of light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a promise, one made not with words, but with hoofbeats fading into the snow. The storm left behind a silence so deep it hummed. When Ethan opened the door that morning, the air was blue with cold, the kind that felt clean enough to cut. The whole valley shimmered under a fresh crust of snow, unbroken and blinding. It looked peaceful from a distance, but peace had never lasted long in Sage Creek. Sage stood by the barn, her coat glinting silver under the pale sun. She lifted her head when she saw him, gave a low, short call that was half greeting, half warning. Ethan followed her gaze. At the edge of the creek, a black shape broke the smooth white surface of the field. His breath caught. He didn't have to get closer to know what it was. The great horse, one-eyed, impossibly large, the same creature that had carried Sage through the storm, lay there in the hollow between two stones. The snow had half covered its body, frost glinting across its ribs like armor. Ethan's boots crunched in the snow as he approached. The air around the animal was still. Even the wind seemed unwilling to intrude. He knelt beside the body, the cold seeping instantly through his knees. The stallion's hide was stiff, but there was something in the way it lay, head turned slightly toward the rising sun, that made it look less like death and more like rest. "You carried her farther than anyone had a right to," Ethan whispered. "You didn't quit. Not till the end." Sage stepped forward carefully, her breath fogging in the air. She lowered her head until her muzzle brushed the stallion's neck. Then she let out a low, trembling whinny that seemed to pull the air out of the valley. Ethan's throat tightened. He reached out, placing one hand on the horse's shoulder. Beneath the frost, he could feel the scars, deep ridges that told their own story. "You did good," he said again, because there were no better words for what he felt. He didn't know how long he stayed there, the cold biting deeper, time stretching into something soft and unmeasured. Eventually he stood and went back to the cabin for tools. When he returned, shovel in hand, the light had shifted. The sun hung low, bleeding gold across the snow. The ground was frozen hard, each strike of the shovel ringing like a bell. It was slow work, cruel work, the kind that stripped away thought until only rhythm remained. Snow mixed with dirt, his breath coming out in thick clouds. Sage stood nearby, watching quietly, her shadow long and thin across the ground. Every few minutes, she would stamp a hoof or blow through her nostrils, as if urging him to keep going. When the hole was deep enough, Ethan rested the shovel and looked down at the stallion one last time. The eye that had once burned gold was dull now, the socket empty of everything but peace. He crouched, slipped his arms under the great head, and heaved. It took nearly all his strength to move the animal into the grave, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Sweat mixed with frost on his face, the pain in his back sharp and bright. When the horse finally settled, the silence that followed felt holy. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a square of fabric, a torn piece of the old wool blanket he'd used to keep Sage alive that first night. He laid it gently over the stallion's chest. "You earned this," he murmured. Then he began to fill the grave. Each shovelful of snow and soil landed with a soft thud, muffling the world a little more. Sage moved closer, pressing her head against his shoulder. Together, they watched as the mound rose, as the last curve of dark hide disappeared under white. When it was done, Ethan straightened, his breath coming ragged and slow. His arms trembled from the effort, but the ache felt right. He turned to a broken fence post nearby, pulled his knife from his belt, and began to carve. The letters came slowly, unevenly, but steady. For the one who carried more than he had to. When he finished, he planted the post at the head of the grave. The sunlight caught on the fresh cuts, making the words glow like gold. For a moment, everything was still. Even Sage stopped moving, her ears turning toward the faint murmur of the creek. Ethan sank to his knees. The cold burned through his jeans, but he didn't care. He folded his hands, not because he believed anyone was listening, but because it felt like the only thing left to do. "I don't know what you were," he said softly. "But you saved her. You saved me, too." His voice cracked, the sound breaking like thin ice. Sage nickered quietly beside him, the sound a fragile echo of comfort. He reached out and rested his hand on her neck. "He did it for you, girl," he whispered. "And for me." For a long time they stayed there, man and horse and the grave that bound them. The sun began to drop behind the ridge, spilling light across the snow like melted gold. Tiny droplets formed on the branches overhead, glimmering as they fell. Ethan rose slowly. His knees ached, his fingers numb. He looked one last time at the mound and the simple marker that stood above it. The air was perfectly still. Even the wind had forgotten how to move. As he turned toward the cabin, a faint tremor rolled through the ground beneath his boots. It was so soft, he almost missed it. Then came a sound, barely there, a single, deep, distant whinny drifting from somewhere beyond the ridge. He stopped, heart hammering. The echo lingered, long and low, before fading back into silence. He didn't know if it was real or if his grief was playing tricks again, but when he looked at Sage, she was staring in the same direction, ears pricked, eyes bright with something like recognition. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I hear it too." They walked back through the snow together, the world dimming around them. The air smelled faintly of ash and pine and something else, something like forgiveness. At the cabin, Ethan paused at the door. He looked back once more at the ridge, at the grave hidden beneath the white. The wind stirred then, gentle and brief, enough to lift the edge of Sage's mane. It carried a sound with it, not words, but presence. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Rest easy, soldier." When he opened them again, the valley was quiet. The day was ending, but not in the same way as before. This ending carried warmth, the kind that grows out of cold ground, small but unstoppable. He led Sage into the barn, spreading fresh straw, making sure she had hay and water. The sky outside was fading from gold to violet, and the first stars blinked awake. He leaned against the stall door, watching her settle. "You keep him in your dreams," he said. "That way he'll never really go." She turned her head toward him, her eyes soft and steady. He smiled, tired but peaceful, then stepped back into the open air. The night met him like a sigh, cold, vast, infinite. And for the first time, Ethan felt small in a way that didn't hurt. Somewhere in that great silence, something sacred had shifted. He stood there until the stars blurred and the world dissolved into the soft hum of snow and wind. And when he finally went inside, he didn't light the lamp. The fire's glow was enough. Spring didn't arrive all at once in Sage Creek. It crept in quietly, like a shy traveler, melting the edges of the snow one breath at a time. By late March, patches of brown earth peeked through the drifts, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing pine and wet stone. The creek, once silent beneath its sheath of ice, now whispered again, its voice hesitant, but growing stronger each day. Ethan rose earlier now, drawn from sleep by light instead of loneliness. He spent the mornings tending to Sage, brushing her coat, cleaning the stall, talking in that low, steady tone that both calmed her and filled the silence inside him. The foal had changed since winter. Her ribs no longer showed. Her stride had lengthened. There was muscle in her legs, pride in her posture. And when she ran, the gray of her coat caught the sun and turned it silver. He watched her one morning from the fence line, the smell of coffee and sawdust still clinging to his hands. Sage galloped across the thawing field, kicking up arcs of mud and light. Her hooves struck the ground with the confidence of something born for open space. For the first time, Ethan thought she truly belonged here. Not rescued, not trapped. Alive. Wade Morgan came riding up the hill that afternoon, his coat unbuttoned, hat tilted against the wind. He carried a flask, and the same easy half-smile he'd always worn in the old days. Ethan hadn't seen another human since the storm, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to greet him. "You look less like a ghost than the last time I saw you," Wade said, swinging down from his horse. His boots sank into the damp soil with a squelch. "Guess the mountain hasn't swallowed you whole yet." Ethan smirked. "Not for lack of trying." Wade glanced toward Sage, who was watching them from the paddock, ears pricked, tail flicking. "So that's her, the little miracle you pulled out of the snow." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Name's Sage." Wade stepped closer, keeping his movements slow. "Pretty thing. Got her mother's eyes?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Her mother's gone." Wade nodded, removing his hat. "Then she's got yours." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He turned away, pretending to adjust the fence post. "You didn't ride up here just to hand out compliments." Wade shrugged. "No, figured I'd check in before the world forgets where you live." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Got a report last week. Wild herds moving down from the North Range. Big ones. Unusual for this time of year." Ethan took the paper without reading it. "You think that means something?" Wade smiled faintly. "In this country, everything means something. You just have to listen long enough." They shared coffee by the barn, the conversation drifting from horses to weather to nothing at all. When Wade left, Ethan watched him ride down the valley until he was only a dark speck against the green-gray hills. He realized he didn't feel that old tug of emptiness anymore. The loneliness had softened into something quieter, solitude, not exile. That evening, clouds gathered along the western ridge, turning the sky the color of iron. Sage grew restless, pacing the fence. Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon. At first he saw nothing but the shimmer of distant heat. Then the ground itself seemed to move. A wave of dust, slow and rolling. It wasn't the wind. He walked closer, heart hammering, and the shape began to take form. Dozens, no, hundreds of wild horses streamed across the plain, their coats flashing gold, chestnut, cream, and shadow. They moved like a single breath of the earth, muscles rippling in unison, manes flying. And leading them, Ethan's breath caught, was a figure he knew before his mind could name it. A massive stallion, coat shining like forged silver, one eye clouded and scarred. The one-eyed horse. He stood frozen at the fence as the herd thundered closer, the ground trembling beneath his boots. Sage lifted her head high and called out, a clear, ringing whinny that cut through the wind. The stallion answered. A low, resonant cry that carried across the valley like a hymn. Ethan's eyes stung. The world blurred, not from the dust, but from something deeper. The sound that filled the valley wasn't noise. It was recognition, the living calling to the lost. The herd slowed as it reached the edge of the clearing. For a heartbeat, time held still. The stallion turned his head, meeting Ethan's gaze from across the field. The single golden eye caught the light of the setting sun, flaring with life. Sage pawed at the ground, impatient. Ethan reached for the latch on the gate, fingers trembling. "Go on, girl," he whispered. "He came back for you." He hesitated. Every part of him wanted to hold on, to keep the one good thing he'd been given. But he knew better. Holding on too long only breaks what you love. He lifted the latch, The gate swung open. Sage bolted forward in a spray of dirt and light. The herd parted for her, forming a circle of motion and breath. She slid into their rhythm like she'd always belonged there. The stallion dipped his head once, a gesture of acceptance, maybe even farewell. Ethan stood at the fence, one hand resting on the wood, the other pressed to his chest. He could feel his heart beating like hooves. The dust rose around the herd, catching the sunlight until the air itself glowed. When they finally turned and ran, they moved together as one. Sage at their center, her coat shining like water, her mane streaming behind her like smoke. The valley filled with sound, the kind that echoed in the bones long after the air went still. Ethan watched until they vanished into the far hills, swallowed by the haze of dusk. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of gratitude, of the strange peace that comes when you finally let go. He leaned against the fence, eyes closed. The last light of the sun touched his face, warm and fleeting. In the distance, a single whinny echoed back, high and clear, a promise, not an ending. By the time night settled, the stars had come out, scattered bright as embers across the sky. Ethan lit no fire that night. He didn't need one. The world itself was burning gently around him, alive with the warmth of everything that had been given back. He whispered into the dark, "Run free, Sage." And for the first time, the words didn't break him. They mended. He stood there until the chill began to creep in, then turned toward the cabin. Behind him, the field lay quiet, but the air still shimmered faintly, like a trail of light too stubborn to fade. The morning after the Tsusin, herd vanished. The world felt different, emptier, but in a way that didn't ache. The fields of Sage Creek shimmered under a thin veil of mist. Every blade of grass beaded with dew. The air smelled of thawing soil and pine sap. Ethan stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking toward the horizon where the horses had disappeared. The fence gate hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to close it. He brewed coffee slowly, listening to the soft rattle of the pot on the stove. The cabin was quiet, except for Dusty's occasional sigh as the old dog dozed near the hearth. The silence, once suffocating, now had weight and warmth. He'd spent so many mornings fighting it. Now he let it fill the room. When he stepped outside, the sunlight was sharp enough to make him squint. The snow had melted almost completely, leaving behind patches of new green. The creek ran fast and clear, its song carrying across the valley. Everything alive seemed to breathe in rhythm, as though the earth itself had exhaled after a long winter. He walked down to the fence line, boots sinking into the damp soil. The prints from the herd were still there, hundreds of them overlapping, pressed deep into the ground. They'd carved their story into the earth, the way storms carve memory into wood. Ethan crouched, brushing his fingers over the impressions. The dirt was cold and wet against his skin. He could almost feel the power of those hooves, the heartbeat that had thundered across this place just hours ago. He whispered, "You made it home, girl." As he stood, a faint sound drifted down the ridge. Water trickling, birds calling, and then something softer. A low whinny, stretched thin by distance. It could have been the wind. It could have been something else. He smiled anyway. I hear you. Back at the cabin, he packed his old rucksack, the same one he'd used in the rodeo days, back when life was measured in miles and seconds instead of seasons. Inside, he placed his worn notebook, a few tools, a flask of water, and the carved wooden charm Lily had once tied to her toy horse. He'd kept it in a drawer for years, unable to touch it. Now he tied it to the strap of his pack. It swayed gently, catching the sunlight. Ethan spent the next few days rebuilding what the winter had taken. He fixed the roof shingles, cleaned the barn, and mended the corral gate. He worked until his hands ached and his back burned. But the pain was a good kind, the kind that said you were still here. Each strike of the hammer, each breath of sawdust and sweat tethered him back to life. Wade Morgan rode up again near the end of the week. The sheriff dismounted at the creek and called out, "You planning to join the living world again, Cole?" Ethan grinned, the expression so natural it startled them both. "Guess that depends on which world you mean." Wade's gaze swept over the valley, the fresh fences, the trimmed barn, the field slowly turning green. "Looks like you're already halfway there." He reached into his coat and handed over a small envelope. Inside was an official-looking document. "Ownership papers," Wade said. "Registered under your name. The Foal's brand is yours now. Figured it was about time someone made it right." Ethan turned the paper over in his hands. "Doesn't matter much now," he said. "She's where she's supposed to be." "Maybe," Wade said. "But so are you." They shared coffee by the porch, talking in the quiet way men do when there's nothing left to prove. Before leaving, Wade glanced toward the ridge. "You ever think about heading back to town? Folks might be glad to see you again." Ethan looked out over the valley. "Not yet. I've got things here that need tending." Wade nodded. "Then I'll let the mountain keep you a little longer." He mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the whisper of wind. That night, the moon rose full and gold over the hills. Ethan sat by the window, writing by the flickering glow of the stove. The page before him was nearly filled. Words and sketches, bits of memory and moments he didn't want to lose. Near the bottom, he wrote carefully. "He carried more than his foal that night. He carried me out of the dark. He stared at the line for a long time, then set the pencil down. Outside, the air stirred. The wind moved through the pines, brushing against the cabin like a sigh. He could almost hear the echo of hooves again, distant and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to fade." He stepped outside, letting the door close softly behind him. The valley stretched wide under the moon, glowing silver. The grave up near the ridge was barely visible now, just a rise in the land, covered in new grass. He walked toward it, each step slow, measured, deliberate. When he reached the marker, he knelt. The carved words, "For the one who carried more than he had to," were weathered but clear. He traced them with his fingers, the wood smooth under his touch. "You can rest easy now," he said quietly. "She's free. And I think I am too." The wind shifted, brushing across the grass. Somewhere far off, a horse called, a sound so faint it barely touched the edge of hearing. Ethan closed his eyes and listened until it faded. When he stood again, the first light of dawn had begun to spread across the valley, painting everything in pale gold. The mountains glowed, and the creek shimmered like a river of glass. He walked back to the cabin with the sun at his back and the smell of morning on the air. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. He poured water into the kettle and waited for it to boil, the quiet filling every corner. On the shelf above the table, the photograph of his family caught the new light. For years, it had been just a relic of what was gone. Now it looked like a promise, proof that something once bright could survive the dark. Ethan opened the door and let the morning in. The wind swept through the cabin, stirring the ashes in the stove until they glowed faintly red, as if answering. He smiled, a small, honest smile that belonged to no one but him. As he stepped out onto the porch, a single feather drifted down from the sky. It spun lazily before landing on the step beside his boot. He picked it up, twirling it between his fingers. It shimmered faintly, silver gray, the same color as Sage's mane. He tucked it into his pocket and whispered, "You stay wild, wherever you are." The wind rose again, rushing through the valley. It carried no sorrow this time, only life. Ethan tilted his head back, breathing it in. The sky above him stretched endless and blue, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to live beneath it. Behind him, the cabin stood small but steady, smoke curling from the chimney like a signal of quiet defiance. Ahead, the world waited, vast, unbroken, and mercifully unknown. Ethan walked down toward the creek, following the sound of water and the rustle of grass. The wind trailed after him, whispering through the sagebrush, and if anyone had been there to listen, they might have sworn they heard the faint rhythm of hooves, fading into the dawn. If this story touched your heart, tell us what moment stayed with you the most. We read every comment, and your words mean more than you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next story, because sometimes the quietest tales are the ones that change us forever.